Ferruccio Lamborghini is the man behind one of the biggest luxury car brands in the world. But what most people don't know about him is that before he started making supercars, he actually had the biggest tractor company in Italy. And what even less people know is that before he was a tractor tycoon, he was a prisoner of war. Ferruccio's engineering skills are what helped him create some of the best tractors in the world. But an argument with Enzo Ferrari is what would make him change course and set out to create the best supercar in the world, leading to a huge ongoing battle between the two men. But before we get to all that, let's first go back to a small town in Italy in 1916. Ferruccio Lamborghini was the child of two grape farmers. Growing up in Italy at that time was tough. It was a country struck by financial ruin after the war, and shortages of food, many of its citizens were going hungry. But despite the hardships, Ferruccio managed to have an optimistic outlook on life. He spent his childhood working on his parents' grape farm. Ferruccio's father had hoped that one day his son would be the heir to this farm, which had been passed down from generation to generation. But the young Lamborghini had other plans. Growing up on the farm, Ferruccio had learnt the value of hard work, but he'd also discovered his passion for mechanics. The Lamborghinis had a tractor that Ferruccio would spend hours taking apart and fixing every day. At that time, automobiles were still in their infancy. Mechanics was cutting-edge technology, and Ferruccio was much more interested in engines than traditional old farming. This meant that when Ferruccio left school, he had a big decision to make. Does he become a farmer like his father, continuing the family tradition, or does he completely change course, following his passions, and become an engineer? And of course, much to his father's disappointment, he chose engineering and moved to Bologna to attend a technical college. After graduating, Ferruccio got a job as a mechanic, but it wouldn't be long before the world was plunged into another war. Ferruccio was drafted into the Royal Italian Air Force, but when his mechanical abilities were discovered, he was sent to the Greek island of Rhodes to help with maintaining the army's tractors and diesel trucks. Ferruccio didn't know it at the time, but this experience of working with military vehicles and tractors would come in very handy later down the line. In 1943, Italy signed an armistice agreement, effectively announcing their part in the war was over. The Italian troops were evicted from Rhodes, and Germany took over the garrison. But Ferruccio asked to stay as a citizen and opened his own mechanical workshop on the island. But then as the war was ending in 1945, Germany was facing defeat, and the Allied forces took over Rhodes Island. They initially took everyone as prisoners, including Ferruccio. Luckily for him, after seeing Ferruccio's mechanical skills, the Allied forces simply had him spend a year fixing their vehicles, before in 1946 allowing him to leave and return home to Italy. And it's here that the incredible story of Lamborghini really begins. After Ferruccio returned to Italy, he faced a problem. He no longer had a job. He'd spent his time on Rhodes working as a mechanic, but now he felt like he wanted to do something more. And while he was back in Italy, he saw a market starting to emerge. He noticed that poor farmers couldn't afford to buy tractors after the war. Not only that, but the price of petrol skyrocketed due to the post-war prohibitions, so many farmers couldn't even afford to run their tractors. Ferruccio saw all of this happening around him and decided he could solve some of these problems. The Italian government was auctioning off military vehicles to try and fund their economic rebuild, and Ferruccio seized this opportunity. He'd spent many years working on a lot of the vehicles, and so he knew exactly what he needed and what price he should pay. He managed to buy a cheap British Morris engine at auction, which he was able to modify. Ferruccio's new engine design used a fuel atomizer. This meant that whilst they still needed petrol to get started, once they were started, the engine switched to the much cheaper diesel fuel. This was an incredible innovation and a genius workaround for his country's fuel problem, and thus the very first Lamborghini tractor was born. And he also used a smaller frame to reduce the cost even further. Not so fast though. Sure, Lamborghini had innovated the engine and built a very well-made tractor, but the market was already dominated by very well-established tractor brands, the likes of Fiat, Trattori, and Landini. There wasn't much room for a newcomer. And so, despite the great design, Lamborghini tractors started very slowly. At first, Ferruccio was simply making one tractor a week, completely by himself. But his tractors were selling. His cost-cutting techniques proved to be a very effective sales pitch. In fact, it wouldn't be long before Ferruccio opened up his own factory and hired some staff to help speed up the production of his tractors. But in order to really ramp up production and compete with the bigger tractor companies, he needed money. And so his father allowed him to use the family farm as collateral for a bank loan, and Ferruccio was able to buy 1,000 Morris engines and get to work. Ferruccio was extremely excited about the potential of his business, but because of this business loan he'd taken out, he knew that if his company failed, his family could lose their farm. The good news though was that Ferruccio's technical ingenuity had allowed him to successfully break into the tractor market, and he already had another trick up his sleeve, as Ferruccio managed to design his own engine, meaning Lamborghini tractors would no longer be relying on modifying the British engine, and instead could create their own engines in-house. And this ended up being really perfect timing. The Italian government announced they would grant loans to Italian farmers that were purchasing Italian-made farming machinery, and since Ferruccio was now making the engines himself, his machinery qualified, and he saw a huge rise in demand for his tractors. By this point, Lamborghini was producing 200 tractors a year, and Ferruccio was so convinced by the quality of his tractors that every year he would host a tractor pulling competition in his hometown. 2 tractors would be tied together and compete in a kind of tug-of-war style competition to determine which tractors performed the best. Lamborghini tractors always won. So at this point, things were looking good for Ferruccio. As he ramped up production even more, Lamborghini tractors started to become one of the biggest tractor manufacturers in all of Italy, and as a result, Ferruccio was now becoming one of the richest men in the country. However, whilst all of this was going on, Ferruccio somehow managed to find time to modify a Fiat Topolino that he owned. He added a bigger engine, removed the back seats, and entered into one of Italy's most famous races. Ferruccio was excited to test his car against some of the biggest names like Alfa Romeo, Ferrari, and Maserati. However, disaster would strike midway through the race, as Ferruccio crashed his car into the side of a restaurant in Turin. This would mark the end of Ferruccio's racing career and completely change the direction of his life. Despite his racing career being over, with so much money to spend, Ferruccio bought lots of cars. In particular, he loved the luxury grand touring cars. During the 1950s, Italian manufacturers were at the forefront of the car industry. The Italian brands seemingly captured an elegance and tradition that German, British, and American manufacturers could never quite achieve. Throughout the 20th century, there were the likes of Alfa Romeo, Fiat, Maserati, and Ferrari, who were all pushing the boundaries of engineering and beauty. Ferruccio owned cars from all of these Italian brands, but for each of the cars he owned, he always found a problem that prevented the cars from being perfect in his eyes. The Ferrari 250 GT was the most luxurious car he owned. Ferraris were seen as the pinnacle of success and were sought after by celebrities and the ultra-rich. But Ferruccio wasn't so fond of his Ferrari. He even went as far as describing his 250 GT as too noisy and too rough to be a proper road car. Not only did Ferruccio not like the driving experience of his Ferrari, but it was also always breaking down. After having the clutch fixed a number of times, Ferruccio decided he would take it to one of the mechanics that worked at his factory. When they checked out the clutch that was causing all these problems, they were both shocked to find that the clutch used in the Ferrari, the luxurious, high-performance, incredibly expensive Ferrari, was the same clutch as the ones used in the Lamborghini tractors. Ferruccio upgraded the clutch with something that was better suited to a luxury sports car, and immediately went to pay a visit to Ferrari's creator, Enzo Ferrari. This was no small feat. Enzo Ferrari was well known for his wicked temper and thin patience, but this didn't deter Ferruccio. He felt like he was doing Ferrari a favor by suggesting an improvement to his car. Unsurprisingly, Enzo did not see it this way. In fact, it's said that he got very angry with Ferruccio and told him, "The clutch is not the problem. The problem is you don't know how to drive a Ferrari and you break the clutch." He didn't stop there though. It's also believed that Enzo finished by saying, "Let me make cars, you stick to making tractors." This insult was painful for Ferruccio. He had come to Enzo as an equal, a fellow mechanic, but he left feeling belittled and humiliated. It was on this day that Ferruccio vowed to make his own cars that would be better than Ferraris. In fact, they would be the best cars that money could buy. And that's the mantra that Lamborghini's car company was founded on, building the perfect car. Before the next chapter, I want to give you some free money, which I know sounds too good to be true, but I'm actually serious. I spoke to my friends over at the investment platform Moomoo, and they've agreed to give Magnates Media viewers up to 15 free stocks just for joining and making a deposit. Honestly, when they told me this, I thought that was a mistake, but it's real, and it's random what free stocks you get. Could be Apple or Tesla, so unless you literally hate money, why would you not join and make a deposit? For now, this deal is currently for US residents, or if you're in Australia, there's a cashback deal available instead. But wait, it gets even better. Moomoo is a commission-free trading platform for stocks, ETFs, options, and lots more. So you can trade and invest easily from their app wherever and whenever you want. So no matter whether you're someone who's never invested before and just wants to get some completely free stocks to get you started, or whether you're an experienced investor looking for a reliable trading platform with pro tools other platforms don't have, Moomoo is the answer. To get this exclusive deal for 15 free stocks, click my link in the description below now, This is genuinely a crazy good deal, but it's only for a limited time, so please be fast so you don't miss out. With his sights set on disrupting the luxury sports car industry and getting revenge against Enzo Ferrari, Ferruccio twisted the knife and went a step further by poaching one of Enzo Ferrari's chief engineers. With the right team in place, Ferruccio targeted the Turin Auto Show in 4 months' time as the place where he would announce his arrival in the automobile industry. Designing a car and engine from the ground up wasn't easy, but with the experience of Ferruccio and the infrastructure already in place from its tractor factories, he and his team were able to get a prototype ready for the car show in just 4 months. There was one issue though, the car didn't have an engine. Ferruccio had actually fallen out with one of his team members over disagreements on the engine to use, meaning they didn't have anything ready in time for the auto show in 1963. But Ferruccio had an idea, and instead filled the engine bay with bricks so that the car was low enough to the ground to look like it had an engine. The hood of the car was kept locked during the show, and thankfully no one requested to see under the hood. Even without an engine, Lamborghini's new car got plenty of attention, and after the show, the car went into production. This first car would be named the Lamborghini 350 GT, and they sold 13 cars on release. Admittedly, this doesn't sound like a lot, but in the supercar category that these brands are operating in, back then for a brand new entry into the market to get 13 sales on release is actually pretty good. And over the next 2 years, 120 cars were produced and sold, giving Lamborghini a respectable start in the automobile industry. But it wasn't quite the overthrowing of Ferrari that Ferruccio had hoped for, so he began working on improving the 350 GT further. Meanwhile, some of his top engineers were working on a car in secret. They envisioned the future of Lamborghini being something different to the grand touring cars that Ferruccio liked making. Their prototype, nicknamed the P400, was designed as a road car with racing pedigree. They knew their boss wouldn't approve because it said that Ferruccio wanted to stay away from making race cars after his crash all those years ago. But after getting the prototype finished, they showed their work to Ferruccio and hoped that they could convince him it wouldn't be too expensive to produce. As they expected, Ferruccio was initially against the idea, but he was very eager to grow his car business and beat Enzo Ferrari, and Ferruccio ultimately decided that he could use this new race car his team had designed as a marketing tool, something to get people talking about his brand. This new model was completed just 2 days before the 1966 Geneva Motor Show, where it was to be unveiled to the public. It would be called the Lamborghini Miura, and what really set the car apart was the engine placement, which was inspired by Formula 1 cars. Instead of being in the front of the car, the engine was placed at the back to get that extra bit of performance. It was an innovation at the time that would soon become widely adopted. Ironically, this car that Ferruccio had been so against at first would be the car that put Lamborghini automobiles on the map. The Miura quickly became iconic. Its unique design and incredible performance garnered the attention of the world. It was seen in some of the biggest films at the time, including The Italian Job, and celebrities adopted the car as the ultimate show of wealth. Lamborghini was truly on the rise, but unfortunately, disaster was about to strike. Throughout the 60s, Ferruccio's companies were thriving. Lamborghini Automobiles was rivaling the top cars of the day, including Ferrari, and Lamborghini Tractors was continuing to produce some of the finest tractors in the world and was selling quite successfully to customers outside of Italy as well. But the turn of the next decade would bring with it some new challenges. The first problem began when some of the biggest importers of tractors in both South Africa and Bolivia abruptly cancelled their orders due to political turmoil. This left Ferruccio with hundreds of ready-made tractors that he couldn't get rid of. On top of that, his workers were unionized, so he couldn't fire them to cut costs. Expenses started spiraling out of control, and Ferruccio was left with little choice but to sell his company to a rival tractor group. The problems didn't stop there though. With his car company, sales had begun to slow as well, as Italy was coming to the end of an economic boom that had taken place since the end of World War II. Ferruccio sold a 51% stake of Lamborghini Automobiles to a Swiss businessman for $600,000, which is the equivalent of around $4 million today. But then in 1973, there was a global oil crisis, and with the price of fuel so high, manufacturing became too expensive, and the demand for high-performance cars plummeted. All of this was too much for Ferruccio, and he sold his remaining 49% stake in Lamborghini as well, and retired to an estate in central Italy to live out the rest of his life. He kept himself busy, and even returned to his roots as a farmer, and his entrepreneurial spirit was so strong that he even built a successful wine business in his retirement. But this all raises the question, what happened to the Lamborghini companies once their founder and innovator retired? In the early 70s, the Agricultural Machinery Group, SAME, purchased Lamborghini tractors from Ferruccio, and the group still owns Lamborghini tractors to this day. But as for Lamborghini's most famous company, Lamborghini Automobiles, the business has gone through a bit more turbulence over the years. Firstly, with the economic and political situation in Italy worsening over the 70s, Lamborghini Automobiles actually filed for bankruptcy in 1978. By 1980, the iconic Italian sports car brand was picked up by a pair of successful French brothers who purchased the failing company at a discounted rate of $3 million. Under this leadership, Lamborghini saw some resurgence, and in 1987, it was sold to Chrysler for $25 million, who were looking to diversify their portfolio of car manufacturers. Chrysler briefly saw some profit before sales in the US dropped, and they had to offload the company. This time, an Indonesian conglomerate paid $40 million for the privilege of owning Lamborghini, and they once again managed to reignite Lamborghini's brand. Unfortunately, a financial crash in the Asian market would mean the company would have to be sold once more. The strong European markets at the time meant that Volkswagen were going on a huge spending spree, and in 1988 they purchased Lamborghini along with several other car brands like Bentley. And to this day, the Volkswagen Group still own the Lamborghini brand under their subsidiary company Audi. And so, whilst Lamborghini has gone through a lot of ups and downs since Ferruccio sold his company, it looks like Volkswagen made a very smart purchase. The 21st century has seen a huge resurgence in demand for supercars, and Lamborghini has been at the forefront of that. Whilst Ferruccio Lamborghini wasn't quite successful in dethroning Ferrari during his lifetime, you could argue that nowadays, Lamborghinis are pretty much the go-to supercar choice for new money millennials. To many, they're a symbol of wealth and success, which is pretty crazy, because if Enzo Ferrari had just listened to Ferruccio's advice all those years ago, Lamborghini would probably never have even begun. Now, if you thought a prisoner of war starting Lamborghini was crazy, wait until you hear about the orphan boy who created Rolex. The epic rags to riches story of Rolex is available for you to watch right now by clicking the thumbnail on screen. So if you want to know the truth about Rolex's history and why Rolexes are really so expensive, check this video out right now. I'll see you there. Cheers.